and welcome everyone. And this is a session with Suha, and she's wonderful, and she just landed a really great job with Slum. And she's going to talk about the user stories in action. And without further ado, I'll let her take over the screen and start her presentation.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from where you're joining us today from. From this session, we're going to look at Salesforce user stories in action. First of all, congratulations to Pakistan Dreaming team for the very first inaugural event. I'm sure it's going fabulous and looking forward to more such events in the future. A little about me. I have been pretty much in the Salesforce and the Agile world for 12 plus years now. Currently, I work for Slalom Canada and part of the Salesforce Delivery Excellence team. Over the last decade, I've coached several organizations in their Agile journey. And in relation to Agile, I have a certified Scrum professional, certified Scrum Master, and a PMI Agile certified professional certifications. I'm also 13x Salesforce certified, which includes my B2B solution architect, which I gained recently. I'm also a co-founder of Salesforce Couple, a website where we host a lot of Agile and Salesforce content. Outside that, I'm an artist, dancer, and an avid traveler. So in this session, we are pretty much going to take a deep dive into how do we create good Salesforce-specific user stories, how do we go ahead and prioritize them, and how efficiently can we estimate them. So today's session is primarily going to be all around Salesforce user stories. So I'll just start with user story creation. And you would have heard this if you've been in the Agile world and from many Agile experts, especially even if you're using Scrum framework for your Agile delivery. It's something called as an INVEST criteria. They say a good story usually fits into the acronym INVEST criteria, right? So the acronym INVEST stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. I'm just going to take a step back and talk about each of this in the INVEST, and then we will go ahead and see how do we create good user stories, right? So the I in the INVEST, independent, means we try to keep stories as independent as possible. Through Agile, one main thing that we are trying to achieve is to deliver business value sooner and faster. So the more independent our user stories are, the faster we are able to deliver that for our business, right? The more the dependency, the problem there is that, okay, my story A is dependent on story B and story C. So unless my B and C are built and, I cannot go and do my story A. So there's a kind of dependency. So the way we can deliver this is by keeping them as independent as possible. N in the INVEST stands for negotiable. So any user stories that we create should be negotiable. Basically, we should be able to have discussions on that user story. It should never be like a dead end. We should, as a team, be able to know what the user story is all about, have a discussion about it, have questions, get our clarifications. There should be room for negotiations in this user story. V in INVEST stands for valuable. So what valuable means is, end of the day, why are we even creating user stories and what are we trying to do here? End of the day, we want to add business value. So any story that you create should have some value to it. If there is no value in a user story that we are creating, then it's actually a very good alarm that do we really need this user story at all? There is absolutely no value it's adding, right? So that's another thing to keep in mind while we create user stories. E in INVEST stands for estimable. What that means is whatever stories that we are able to create, once we discuss it, our Scrum team should be able to go ahead and break them down into tasks and estimate each of them. So they should be estimable. We cannot make stories where you cannot go and say that, hey, I can't story point estimate this, or it's really hard for me to even understand and break them down into tasks, right? That should never happen. So they should always be estimable. S in INVEST stands for small. It's again like the one I said for independent, right? The smaller the stories are, again, it's going to be, we are able to deliver it sooner and faster and realize the business value faster. So try to keep your user stories as small as possible. If you find them getting bulkier, which usually does happen to a lot of us while we're creating stories, try to see how we can slice them down into smaller chunks. So, you can still deliver them sooner and faster. And we're going to look at these with an examples as well while we talk through this session. And, you will realize why I'm saying this is, again, very important. T in invest stands for testable. So whatever user story, again, we create, it should have testable acceptance criteria. We should clearly be able to say whether each of these statements are like a pass or a fail, right? We should be able to test. We should be able to validate the stories. If you cannot test or validate a story, again, that's an alarm that you may want to rethink what you're doing. So now that I talked a little bit about the invest criteria and how good stories usually fit in invest criteria, I'll take a next step and walk through what are these different parts of a user stories, right? So irrespective of the tools that we use, whether you use Jira, Microsoft TFS, Asana, or whatnot, right? Any tools that you're using. And this is, again, not just applicable just to the user story, it's to any product backlog item, whether it's your epic, whether it's your feature, whether it's your story, however higher or lower level your requirements are, right? It generally contains these three parts. So the first is the summary. So summary is like your user story or a feature name, if I have to put it very simple, right? So what usually we capture in summary is it's like crisp statement, a very short statement. It's like a name. Basically, you're going to use this to differentiate this particular story from another story. So a tip that I use in my projects, and this can vary based on your organization, your project, and how it's been structured, but something that has come handy to me is what I try to do is I try to keep a feature name shortened, and then I have a hyphenated, and then I put my story summary there. So again, I'm going to walk you through with a Salesforce specific example here so we can relate to this even better. So say, for example, I'm working with a financial services customer, a banking customer, right? And the banking customer is telling me that they have a problem today and they are not able to view or track what the account levels for their customers are. So they have like different account levels. They have like bronze, gold, silver, platinum, and whatnot. And they're trying to have an ability to actually go and see what the account level the customer belongs to, so they can have a conversation based on that, right? The relationship levels. So if this is the problem statement that I'm discussing with my customer, and I'm going to create a story in order for us to achieve this, then what I would probably do is I'm going to call it like, if, again, assuming that I already have a feature for this account management. So then I'm going to just say like ACCT or feature name shorten, and then hyphen capture account levels, right? Keep it short and keep it simple. Again, like I said, it's just to differentiate your current story from another, even without you having to look into the details of the description or acceptance criteria. The second, again, the most important part is your description, which actually contains your value statement, right? Why are we even doing this story? What are we trying to achieve as part of the story? So the description of a user story contains three essential parts. And again, this you will keep seeing as we go through this session. So it will have a persona saying as what user I want to perform what action so that I get what benefit, right? So there is a persona part, there is an action part, and then there's a benefit part to it. Again, with the same example, let me see how I can phrase the description for this. As an account executive, so that is my persona. So what I'm trying to see is as an account executive, I want the ability to see the account levels on my accounts, right? That's my action. So I'm trying to view what the account levels that my customers belong to, right? So that I can have conversations with my customer based on the relationship levels we have. So that's the benefit. So I'm trying to customize my conversation. There could be different perks the customers could get because of the account levels and whatnot. So I want to know what level they belong to so I can have my conversations and perks discussed based on that, right? So that is what actually my description for this particular scenario would look like. So keep it simple and concise. You don't want to keep like this bulky, like don't put too much information in there unless and until it's relevant. Let's eliminate waste, only focus on what is important. In this case, what could be important would be knowing what your different account levels are. Like I mentioned, if there is like silver, gold, bronze, platinum, we just need to know what are the different levels. and what we need to default. For instance, like whenever you create a new account, by default, it would get into a bronze category. If that's the scenario, we want to capture that kind of information. So we need to still capture the important informations, but if something is not directly relevant to this particular story or it's not of value, let's keep it away from adding it to the story itself. And the third part of a user story, which is again, if you remember in the invest criteria, the T stands for testable, right? So these are the set of conditions to be fulfilled as part of this user story, your acceptance criteria. So these are technically your testable statements. You're going to have a clear pass or fail against each of the statements in your user story. Again, a tip that I use, and you could use if it works well for your projects and organization, is I kind of keep it to 3 to 5 acceptance criteria for a story at the max. I really, don't go beyond this, because it's a sign that my story is kind of getting bulkier, it's getting bigger, and I may want to actually slice it down into smaller stories then, right? And again, an easier way for you to keep in mind while we write acceptance criteria is I kind of have 3 parts to it, and this is the kind of standard, right? So we have a given, which is like your initial condition, then what action needs to be carried out, after which, what is the result that you're expecting to happen, right? For this scenario that we discussed on account levels, my acceptance criteria could be, given that I'm an account executive, when I view my accounts, I would like to see the account, I should be able to see the account levels which my accounts belong to. That could be one of my acceptance criteria. So we are trying to see, if I log in as an account executive, can I view account levels on my account? As simple as that, right? We can have another acceptance criteria saying, given that I'm an account executive, when I update my account, I should be able to update the account levels of my customer, which means that, for example, there is an upgrade situation, someone from gold became like platinum, then I should be able to go and edit it, right? We could have a little bit of complexity to this scenario. Like, for instance, say I can only do this on my accounts and I cannot do it on someone else's account. Then we can have another acceptance criteria to cover it, saying, given that I'm an account executive, but I do not own the particular account, then I should not be able to update the account levels of that particular customer, right? So just to give you a little bit of idea, so this is how we start creating user stories, and we keep moving from naming it to adding the value statement and to defining the acceptance criteria. And through this, you're keeping in mind the invest criteria, and you're trying to see if it's actually fitting that. So I'm just going to take a quick few minutes and just give an idea of what are the key things that we would have in mind, not necessarily even added to the description of your story. If you're having a discussion with your product owner about a particular scenario, then what are the key things that might come, especially in the Salesforce world, what we would think while we are kind of detailing our user story. I'm going to walk you through 3 different scenarios here. Imagine that we are trying to capture some new information as part of our Salesforce application, right? Say, for example, this account levels it's like a new information we are trying to capture on accounts. So what are the key things that we might capture, again, to understand it, that we have all the details that we need to build the story is, we might look for things like field label. So what am I going to call this field as? What is this field going to look like? What's the data type, right? So it's going to be a pick list. Is it going to be like a text or whatnot? So in our account levels, it sounds like it's going to be like a pick list. We just want to select one account level for a particular customer, right? And we have already a defined list. We might also need to think about, where do I position this field, and where am I going to put this field, which page layout, under which section, where it should go and sit in the page itself, right? And also things like, is this going to be a required field? Who can edit it? Who cannot edit it? All your field level security. You might actually want to think into all the scenarios while you're trying to add more details to your description, right? And also, while we are grooming the story with our PO, certain things could come to our mind like, hey, am I capturing these account levels just in Salesforce? Are we going to send these account levels to any other downstream systems? Does this information need to be passed somewhere else? Then there's a different ballgame where an integration comes into play, which would necessarily become your separate user story, right? So as we groom and as we discuss the story elements, we might actually end up creating more stories to capture the full process. A next scenario, again, which most of us would face in the Salesforce world would be, how do we handle things when it comes to business processes or business workflows, right? We are trying to do like, a case assignment process or an escalation process or any business process for that matter. What are the key things that would come into our head when we start grooming the story and we start thinking like, okay, I may need to know this information. No, I may need to know that information, those kind of details. There are a few things that we might need to take care of, right? What are the success patterns for this process? What are the failure patterns? What actually triggers this business process itself? What all are the triggering points? And then what are all the actions that we need to perform, right? Again, if the flow is going to become bigger, then we may need to see how do we slice them into smaller ones, correct? And sometimes it also happens that we may need to handle some exception scenarios, and again, that becomes your separate story. But if you're working with your PO to understand a business process, you're probably thinking behind your head all these different scenarios that you need to accommodate and ask questions on. Finally, one more scenario before we move on. Think of it as like an approval process. So you're discussing with your product owner or your business SME about an approval process. They are talking about, say, some kind of financial approvals or case approvals or any approval process for that matter, right? So what are the key things that we might think that we need for a particular story or a particular feature while we are grooming this could be, what all triggers this particular approval process, right? And who are going to be our approvers? Is it like single level approval? Do we have multi-level approvals? Do we have an SLA for this approval? Like, do we need to trigger this into an auto approval? If after a particular so many days, nobody approves it or actions on it, then do we need to do an auto approval on it? Do we need to have delegates for approval if somebody is like out of office or things like that? Do we have to take care of the rejection process if an approval comes? And like I said, as we groom these and as we capture different elements for our questions, they might potentially become your different user stories for the same process. So this is something that I have seen through experience and I wanted to share with you all. These are general user story pitfalls to avoid. I'm just going to give like 30 seconds for everyone to go ahead and read this particular user story that you see on my screen as I read it loud. So as a Salesforce user, I want the ability to click on a button, products by family, to filter products based on the product family and report on products by family so that I can quickly search and report on products. So when you look at this, I just want you to think through this. Do you think the story is good? Do you think there are some things that are alarming in the stories? Do you think there is room for improvement, right? So I just want you to think through this, and I'm going to walk you through what I feel is totally alarming to me, and I feel like we definitely have room for improvement in this particular story. From an objective perspective, it's pretty simple, right? They have like, what they're trying to do is they want to search based on products by family, and so that they're able to filter products by family, right? And they also want to report on it. That's very clear, right? So let's go ahead and see what's really alarming and where is the room for improvement in this particular story. The first things that alarms me is that there is a very generic user that's mentioned here, a Salesforce user. The persona of our user story should be not at all generic. It should be based on a role, right? So why I say this here is a Salesforce user could mean a sales representative to me, a sales manager to Pearl, and like a marketing executive to someone else, right? Or it can even mean everybody who is using Salesforce in the organization, right? So we need to be very clear who the persona of this particular story is, who is the hero or shero we're talking about, right? So the who should be role and it should not be generic. The second thing that alarms me, and I really feel there is room for improvement, is we are saying, I want the ability to click on a button. So I'm going to talk through a few points here again. What is alarming me here is that we are trying to solution this particular problem while we're writing this user story. So anybody who goes and reads it as part of your Scrum team, they're going to think, okay, I need to add a button on the page so that they're going to go and search products by family. I just need to put a button out there on the page layout. I'll tell you what the problem here is. And I want to step back and I say why we should not do this, right? Stories should always be written from an end user's perspective. So put yourself in your end user's shoes. It's as simple as that, right? You should only try to communicate the problem that needs to be solved. What is the problem that your customer is facing? They are not able to search products by family because they have this huge product backlog, huge product catalog, and then they have to go through a ton and millions of products to go and search for their products. It's very time consuming. So they're looking for some efficient ways so that they can filter products by family quicker, right? That's what they're asking. So we should just communicate that particular problem that we're looking to solve and not the solution to deliver. The simple reason being, the person who is creating the user story is not necessarily the expert in solutioning, right? We need to allow the creativity to flow in the team. So one of those agile principles and values is that our Scrum team is like a self-managing team. We have people like with different expertise and different skill set being part of our team, right? You could have your architects, you could have your UX designers, to your developers, to testers, and who not that's needed to build the product, correct? They are the experts to solution. We might think clicking a button is the efficient way, but it might not be in the actual scenario, right? You could use a search filter, which is out of the box to do it. It could even be a custom link. It could be a button. We just don't know, but let's not decide while we are creating the story. Just communicate the problem to solve and let this team decide what is the best solution for it, because they are the experts of the platform and they know the system well. We never know. There could be a flow running on it. There could be something else running on it. There could be integrations which might be involved. So they are the experts when it comes to solutions. So if you are a person who is creating user stories, then always remember that don't go ahead and solution it. Just talk about the problem statement there. The next thing that alarms me in this particular story, and I definitely feel there's room for improvement, is we are talking about two different objectives here, right? And it is potentially can be split up into two different stories so we can deliver it sooner and faster. And I'll tell you why I feel this is two different objectives. The first objective is searching products by family, right? All that we're trying to do is I have to have an ability to quickly search and filter products by family. That's my first objective. The second objective here is the reporting thing. I want to be able to report on products by family, right? So these two can potentially be two different stories, and most likely by prioritization, it sounds like the customer's bigger pain point is filtering products by family. So the search becomes much more in priority in comparison to a report. Probably they might be okay to wait and get this reporting user story later in time. But for them, the searching is more critical. So we are able to realize business value sooner and faster when we keep it smaller. The final one that's kind of alarming to me, again, this is a kind of pitfall we need to avoid, and it's very easy for us to write user stories like this because we generally start, thinking in those relative terms. What is the problem here? All that we're trying to say is, I want to quickly search and report on products. What really is a problem? And I'm going to tell what it is right now. Quickly is such a relative term, right? It can mean different to different people. To me, quickly could be like 40 seconds. To you, it could be like 30 seconds. To someone else, it could be 4 seconds. So it depends on what it means to each of us in the room. So we need to always ensure we are keeping user stories measurable. Let's try to keep a measurable number there instead of saying quickly, which is a very relative term. So now that we know that's not a perfect way to write a user story, let's see how we could have done this better. So I've actually taken a stab at it, and I've tried to broken this into two different basically they're two different objectives, so they become two different stories here. So the first story is very much focused on search. So let's read it now. As a sales representative, very good. I have a persona now clearly mentioned here, much better than the Salesforce user. I want the ability to search products by product family. So here, if you look at it, we haven't solutioned it. It's just still a problem statement. I want the ability to search products by product family. So I'm not saying whether you should put a button or a custom link or a filter. You guys are the expert. Go and decide which is the best solution for this. And now let's look at the so that part. I can filter my products in less than 40 seconds. Wow, look at that now, right? It's so measurable. So when I'm testing this particular story, when my tester is on it, then they will know that all that they need to try to understand is if the result comes back in less than 40 seconds, it's really measurable now. So that looks much cleaner. And now let's look at our second objective. As a sales representative, again, my persona is clear. I want the ability to report on products by product family. Cool. I adjust my objective for the story is also clear, right? My action is very clear so that I can review my products by family. My benefit is also clear, right? So this is a quick example of a typical user story pitfalls we might get into and really stuck, and which we really need to avoid to just ensure that, you know, the value is very clear. To summarize the user story creation section, I just want to take a minute and give a full example of how a user story might look, right? So again, the problem statement here, let me just take a step back and tell you what the problem statement is. Our opportunities, currently we don't have region captured on all that we are looking from a business perspective is to capture regions on opportunities, so that I know like which region my opportunities belong to, you know, and later I can go and report on them and things like that. So that's the problem that I'm facing as a customer. And if you're going to write a story for this, again, taking my own tip here. So assuming there's already a feature which there's sales process, then I would just put my feature name there and then say capture region on opportunities as my summary. A name which is going to be just like a differentiator based on this user story and some other user story, if I have to quickly look at the summary and understand what this is about. The description is going to be my value statement, which has the three parts: the persona as a sales representative, the action, I want the ability to capture the region of my opportunity, my benefit, so that I can view and manage my opportunities by region. And since the region has already set of values, then we are trying to capture that as well, so we know what we need to put in there. EMEA, North America, LATAM, and APAC. My acceptance criteria could be, again, considering it's a very simple scenario, totally not complex. We just want to have an ability to view the region, and we want to have the ability to update the region. So given that I'm a sales rep, when I view my opportunities, I should be able to see the region to which my opportunity belongs to. And also another acceptance criteria could be, given that I'm a sales rep, when I edit my opportunities, I should be able to update the region. So again, each of these are your testable statements. You should be able to say whether this is a clear pass or a fail when you're testing it against the story acceptance criteria. All right, so I just want to take a quick few seconds to go over the tools. Again, like I said, there are different tools out in the market, different customers and different organizations use different tools based on their compliance and needs and stuff. So tools are typically to plan your product backlog, your tracking purposes, your reporting, and your till the release, right? So usually in these tools, what happens is you go and capture all your product backlog items like your epics, your features, your stories, all that's being captured there as and when you get informations on it. You groom the stories, and then you were able to estimate story points and track the stories, right? Like, what are my priorities? You can keep, you know, making your priorities high and low based on the priorities. And then also, like, you know, put them against releases. You can tag them against sprints. When you're doing sprint planning, you can just break them into tasks and estimate that. So all the life cycle can be managed using these tools. Again, one of the common tools that you would see a lot of organizations use is Jira. There are other tools in the market which I have seen organizations use as well, like Trello, Microsoft TFS, Asana. I'm not going to take too much time and go through each of these or the tools or the processes itself. I do have some blogs and videos and Salesforce couple. So if you're interested in knowing some basics about the Agile mindset or how the different Scrum ceremonies or the roles, how they all work, what do you do in sprint planning versus what do you do in grooming, you can definitely go there and look at those videos and the blogs as well. But for the benefit of time, one thing I really want to reiterate in this sessions is, doesn't matter which tool your organization is using, always remember this thing from the Agile Manifesto: individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So what is important for us to be successful is we do not replace the individuals and interactions with these processes and tools. So these are our enablers in order to make the individuals and interactions easier, the process easier for us to be successful as a team, but don't replace it with individuals and interactions, because that's not what the tools and processes are there for. Let me quickly move on and talk about a user story prioritization. Now, like, we all know how to create good user stories. Let's assume that we have good amount of product backlog item. Let's say like we have like 200 stories already written, and we know what we are looking for in each of these stories. We know the values that it's bringing to the customers. All that is in there, right? How do we go and prioritize them? It's not going to be possible for us to deliver 200 stories quickly. How do we even know that which is like very important, which is like not so important? So that's where the user story prioritization comes into play. So probably if you're a product owner, you're going to be working with your business SMEs or your executives or your end users, whoever your business stakeholders are, and come and arrive at the prioritizations. And what we first do is we arrive at something called as a minimum viable product, which is your MVP, right? So what this means is, what is that minimal thing that I need to see the value, right? What's that minimum thing that I cannot live without this particular feature or this particular story. This is that minimum thing that I need to be successful, and this is the minimum thing that I need for me to realize business value, right? So that MVP is something that we try to arrive at while we're doing the user story prioritization. And what we do through this exercise is we try to see each of our product backlog item, like say your user stories, or even if you're doing it at a higher level, at feature level, what we try to do is we try to put it into one of the 4 buckets, which fits under Moscow, right? Moscow stands for must have, should have, could have, and won't have. Imagine physically like you have 4 buckets in front of you for each of this, and we are going to decide each of our user story, whether it's going into our must-have bucket or a should-have bucket or a could-have or won't-have bucket. So that's what we're going to do as a part of an exercise through this. So what does it mean when I say must-have? What does that really mean is that this particular user story is absolutely essential, right? It has high business value. It's totally a non-negotiable item, and it's like very critical for the success of the business. That means it's a must-have product backlog item, right? It's a must-have story. Say, for example, I have a story. This story is important, but it's not like absolutely essential, but it still has high business value. Then it's your should have, right? And say, for example, I'm picking a user story. It's like a nice to have story. It's like a very desirable feature for me, but it's not like that's super important or it's of like high business value. It does have business value, but it's more like a nice to have feature for me, right? So that it could have. If you're reviewing your user story and it's like, you know what, I'm actually fine without this user story in this release. We can actually pick this up later. It's not going to really translate immediately for me to evaluate this particular release, but it might be in my future releases, but not for this one. Then it won't have, right? So we are going to have, when we pick each user story, and we are going to have these parameters in mind and say like, okay, should I put this story in which bucket? Must have, should have, could have, or won't have. So that's how we're going to be prioritizing. And while we do this, there are a few things that are key for considering while we make these decisions, right? So the first and foremost is the business value. Like I was saying, if it's like super critical for the success of my business, it has like, it's critical business value. It's very, very important and very, very high. So that only then I'm saying whether it's a must have or a should have, right? So the business value is one of the critical things that we need to consider while we're making these prioritization decisions. Another thing that we have to keep in mind, if there's any dependencies, right? There could be a relationship with your other user story. You may need to, have this user story in place for another user story to be built. Then you need to ensure that this is also prioritized if the other one is of higher priority, because this is like a prerequisite for it. Again, we'll try to keep the stories as independent as possible, but in cases we cannot, then dependency need to be considered. Another thing which is also critical is a solution approach, right? Any prerequisites or dependencies that we need to take care of. And finally, the risk. When I say solution approach, I want to give you an example which has happened to me in one of my projects. So this was like a fresh Salesforce implementation, and the customer was looking for a customer service optimizations. So we were discussing different things like how do we manage cases, how do we make their service request process seamless, how do we make life easier for their call center executives, and all the different things, right? How do we build the FAQs and stuff like that? So while we were discussing all this, we realized that case management was one of the topmost priority for the business. So because that was giving them more business value, a lot of people call the call center. So it's very important to ensure that they have a process set. Say, for example, that become my first priority item. And then we do have something around FAQs or knowledge articles. So that becomes my second. We wanted to build some Slack channels so they can collaborate. That became my third. So we have these priorities. And while we are discussing, again, not every customer knows very much about Salesforce, right? There could be customers who don't know how Salesforce works. So it was brought to their attention that we need to take care of something we haven't discussed. It could be stories, but it needs to be prioritized under the epic or feature, or it could be a separate feature by itself, right? So that is your org setup. So while we're talking about case management or your knowledge article or any of this to become valuable, first of all, we need to do something because there's a prerequisite, there's a solution approach to how we do this. We need to ensure the org is set up. We know what the profiles are, we know what their personas are going to be, how the permissions are going to be handled, the typical org setup itself, right? Because it's going to be one of the key factors for us to build any other features down the road. And it's going to essentially become more valuable to the customer. So while we brought this up, of course, this became one of our main priorities, and the prioritization list little bit went down by security going up, and then the case management, and then the knowledge article, and then the Slack channels. So this is, again, just to give you a view of what could happen during the user story prioritizations and what we need to consider. Moving on, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how do we estimate user stories. And just to be very clear, I'm talking about the story point estimation here, the estimation on the user story itself, not the task estimation, which we do like during our sprint planning when we know which story who is picking, and then you logically break them down into tasks. So that's a total separate topic. This one, we are just going to focus on estimating user stories. So say, for example, you've been grooming your stories with your product owner. The product owner has answered all your questions on the user story. You have enough information about the user story. You understand the goal of the user story, what value the story is bringing to the customer. Like, you have all your answers, right? So at the end of the process, you do something called as a user story estimation. And you would be hearing this USP as a thing that they keep saying as a measure in your projects. What it stands for is it's user story points. That's what USP is. So when someone tells you it's 1 USP, 2 USP, it stands for user story points. And how do we do this is we do something called as relative sizing. Again, it depends on organizations to organizations. I have seen some organizations who doesn't do estimations at all. A lot of organizations do estimations and they still use story points and relative sizing as the method. So what relative sizing means is, say, for example, we are all part of the same Scrum team, and we have done few sprints earlier, and the smallest ever story we have worked on has been like a field label change, right? We had an opportunities page, we had something called as a region, and we wanted to change it to zone now because they just changed that terminology and they're calling only a zone and it's no more called as region in the company. So that's smallest story we have ever worked on. We just have to go to one page layout of an opportunities and change the field label name. And we did this way back in one of our sprints, but we were the same team who was working on it. So we know that this is the smallest ever story done by our team, right? So we are going to take this as our baseline story and going to estimate our other stories in discussion today based on how, in relation to your base story, is your current story more complex, or does it involve more risk or dependency or uncertainty? All that we're going to consider in relationship to your base story, right? So I'm going to again talk about a few of the considerations that we need to ensure we are considering while we are doing story point estimation. So first and foremost, we need to look at the complexity. So when I say complexity, I'm talking about the functional and technical complexity, right? So like, for example, again, a Salesforce example, if we have to take, we are trying to capture a new field in Salesforce, some new information in Salesforce, right? Let's take the account levels itself. So if we are doing the account level story, and I'm going to estimate story points for that as a team, we are going to do it, then first thing we have to think is, how much is this particular story in complexity, right? How bigger or smaller the complexity is in comparison to my field label change story that I did in the past, right? Most likely it's going to be more complex because we're not just changing the label, we are trying to introduce some new information, and it could be in different places, and we are trying to capture different levels. So it definitely looks a little bit more complex than the field label change itself. So that needs to be considered as one of the first and foremost things, right? The second, and I will emphasize this, only think of this as magnitude of work. And I'm going to say this again and again because magnitude of work is not equal to the time that you will spend building the story. And I'm going to explain you why. So when I say magnitude of work, what it means is how bigger or smaller the effort is going to be to deliver this particular story in relation to the field label change, right? And I'm going to tell you why we should not consider the number of hours we need for build or testing here. So usually when you're estimating the user stories, you are at your grooming stage and you have just groomed your story and you're estimating this very early enough, right? You right now at this point in time, you do not know who is going to pick the story and who is going to develop it or who is going to test it. That is exactly why you should not consider time, because say, for example, you have a senior developer as part of your Scrum team who has been in this project for a very long time. He understands the landscape and systems so well. So for him, maybe it might just take half an hour to build this particular story. There could be someone who is like a junior developer. The skill set is not like, the expertise is not that great as your senior developer in terms of knowing the system or the landscape, because this person has been only in this project this is his first project, right? So then what could happen is he might say like, for him, it might take like 1 hour to build this particular story, right? If there is some, an architect as part of the team, he has bandwidth and he feels he can go and help with this story, it could be different for that person, correct? So what's happening here is the ideal time is based on the ideal person who's going to work on the story. So if we start considering the time in hours that is needed for build or testing the story while we estimate story points, it's not going to work, because at this time we don't know who's even going to work on the story, right? So all we need to do is consider the magnitude of work. How bigger or smaller is the magnitude of work in comparison to my field label change? So that's why we should not be considering time. And this is again a misconception. A lot of people get into this pitfall. I've seen many places where they say, okay, one story point necessarily means 2 hours. No, it doesn't mean that actually, right? It's one story point just means that it is smaller, like in complexity and effort and all that, like magnitude of work, all that stuff, right? That's what it means. It totally doesn't mean it's equal to 2 hours. So these are some things that we need to consider in addition to complexity and magnitude of work. If there is any risk, if there is any dependencies, if there is like any uncertainties, like you've never solutioned such kind of a thing earlier, you don't know if you're going to hit some roadblocks. At such cases, what you usually do to mitigate is try to do like a spike story, like a POC kind of a story. If you're not really sure how this can be solutioned or something, you can always do that before you get into the story. But from a consideration standpoint, you're going to consider all these elements while you're doing story point estimations. And again, if you're in a very primitive stage of your project, you might see something called as a t-shirt sizing, where they're still considering all this, but we are just saying that this is extra small, this is medium, this is large. While if you're in a much more later in your environment, in your much more mature environment, then you're going to use Fibonacci series, where you would say like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on. And again, I recommend if you go beyond 8 story points, you may want to slice them into smaller stories so you can realize business values sooner and faster. But that's how your user story points goes, like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, etc., right? I want to share with you a real story that happened in one of my programs much early in my journey, and just walk you through what you can expect while you're estimating user stories in a room. So let's take a quick look at what the user story that we are looking at currently and what we are going to estimate, right? So this is the user story. As a zonal sales manager, I need all new leads to be sent from Marketo, which is another system, to Salesforce. And while they are coming in, we want it to be assigned to a queue based on their zone, right? So that the respective zonal sales managers can act upon their leads. Imagine if this is the story that we are going to estimate. And we have a few people in the room. We have Karen, who is our product owner. It's distributed team. Typically, we are much more aware of this scenario now. It's a virtual world, right? So Karen is right now at her different location, and she is a product owner, and she is explaining her user story to the team in a room. So this is our Scrum team. We have Alex, Jessica, Rob, Shruti, who are the experts in their own fields, and then they are our developers, testers, and architects and whatnot. They have different skill sets, but they're part of a Scrum team who's going to make this, the team successful and the goal achieved, right? And we also have Scrum Master, who is typically in the same room as well in this scenario. Her name is Kim. So the Alex, Jessica, Rob, and Shruti had some questions. Karen was very nice enough to answer all their questions. So now they have all the information they needed for this particular story. And they were going ahead and using some planning poker cards. Let's imagine for now, imagine some cards in their hand, and they're going to individually estimate the stories without telling it loud to others, right? So Alex thinks this is 3 story points, okay? Jessica thinks it's 5 story points. Rob also thinks it's 5 story points. And Shruti thinks it's 8 story points, right? So this is what they think, and they have logged. Till now, nobody else has known what others think, right? So now that we have everyone in the room estimated the story, now we are going to discuss it as a team. So, just to understand the different perspectives. One of the very key things with the Agile mindset is that we welcome different thoughts and ideas and perspectives in the room, because we have a self-managing team with different expertise and skill sets. So we want all the ideas and thought process flowing, right? That's what is going to make us all successful. So now everyone has laid their cards out, and we know that what story points each of them have. So Alex starts by saying why he thinks it's 3 story points. So Alex feels that they had done something very similar with an order management system, and he feels this is very much similar to that. And so he thinks it might not be really complex, so that's why he had given a 3 story points. Jessica and Rob think otherwise. So both of them had a very similar thought process. They feel Marketo is like a totally different system. It's built on a different framework. It's nothing like the order management system, and that's why they think it's much more complex. And they think it's going to be 5 story points. Shruti, on the other hand, she says it's 8 story point because she had worked in Marketo earlier, and she knows that it is much more complex. It's bigger beast compared to anything else that they have done in the past when you're integrating to Salesforce. And also, she would like to point out that the Marketo team actually works completely in a different time zone. It's totally different team. So when they're working, if they're getting into a bottlenecks, if there's any roadblocks, there is a kind of risk there that is involved in how we are going to mitigate and troubleshoot all these things. And she definitely feels it's really, really complex building that integration between Marketo and Salesforce from her expertise and experience that she has. So now that Alex, Jessica, Rob, and Shruti shared their perspectives, they all understood, like, oh, okay, Alex was like, oh, I really didn't know that this is totally a different system. I just assumed it to be similar to order management. And Jessica and Rob were very happy that Shruti brought that out, that Marketo is like much more complex. There is a risk involved as well. And they finally did this round again. And they came up and said, okay, we're all thinking now it's going to be 8 story points because it's like really has a complexity and there is risk involved. The magnitude of work also looks much higher, right? So what is very important to note here is we don't do a few things. The golden rule is when such scenarios happen, and this is going to happen in most of our user stories, right? We all have different thought process. So our perspectives are going to be different. Never go with a lower number. Don't go with a higher number. Definitely don't average it out, right? That's none of that we are doing. So the golden rule is never do that. We need to ensure there is interactions and communication among the team. We discuss, we share our perspectives and ideas, and finally, we redo this to arrive at the consensus. If you're not arriving at consensus in the second round, again, try to understand what is happening, like what the different perspective is, right? Once everybody knows what the different perspective is, then they're going to arrive at a consensus soon. Finally, I want to end the session with some tips for user story estimation. First and foremost, don't be shy, ask questions, right? We need to understand the user story fully. While you are grooming and you're trying to understand the story fully, you don't even know whether you're going to be working on the story or not. But just think, you are the one who is going to work on the story. And if you are going to work on it, what are all the information that you need? What are all the questions that you have? Try to ask those questions to your product owner and get all the answers before you even think about estimating the stories, right? Just understand the story in its entirety, like fully. You should understand it. You understand what the goal is, you understand what the value it's bringing to the customer, and every element that you need to understand for the user story. Identify a base story. Again, this is something as your team. Don't identify a base story from a different team or from a totally different mix of team members, right? It should be something that you had done in the past. So base story is something that we as a team had delivered something in the past, and that was our smallest, right? So it should be our base story. It should not be someone else's base story, correct? Also, remember to relatively size your other stories in backlog to your identified base story. That's one of the primary things that we're going to do while you're estimating the user stories, right? And like I said, don't go with the lower, don't go with the higher, do not average it. Always hear perspectives and reach consensus among team. And final tip here is, if your user story becomes big, if you feel like it's greater than 8 story points, you may really want to break it down into smaller user stories. So always think when you're writing your user stories, when you're creating it, while you're grooming it, can this be broken down into smaller stories? Am I fitting too many objectives in one? And you may really want to take that decision and keep it smaller as possible, so we are able to realize business value sooner and faster. Just to very much give you a visual example in the real Salesforce world, again, so for example, your field label change was your smallest ever effort that you've ever done. Just renaming your region to zone with no values changed, nothing changed, just in one layout. Then probably a new information capture, which might involve a field creation, could be much more, much complex, or more magnitude of work, or more, from a story point perspective, bigger than your field label change. And if we think of a field creation, but it also involves an integration. For instance, you're not only capturing this information in Salesforce, but either you need to get that information from some system or move that information to another system. That's going to be much more complex compared to your field label change, right? And think of it as a multi-approval process again. That could be like really large when you think about it, when it comes in comparison to your field label change. So just kind of keep this kind of visualization in mind. And like I said, as you groom, you will understand more details, and you can actually add or break them down into smaller user stories and keep realizing business value sooner and faster. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover in the session today. And like I said, if you're looking to learn a little bit more about the Agile mindset, or if you're looking to know a little bit about introduction to Scrum, roles, ceremonies, or anything more on the task estimation, how do we do each of the sprint planning, retrospective, or whatnot, do check out salesforcecouple.com. There are videos and blogs available for that as well. All right, thank you so much for everyone who joined this session. Let's open this up for Q&A.
Hello. I haven't seen any question. Oh, I do see two. So Christian asking about he break user story that are too large into fiction user stories, but there's no immediate business value. We are often tasked to build cars which get only accepted once when they drive. Is that okay?
Okay, let me understand the question correctly. So is the question to know, let me read this once again.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so if there is no immediate business value, but there is some business values in the future, it still is your product backlog item because there is some business value. It's probably going to be in your won't have bucket for the release, because from a priority standpoint, because there is no immediate business value, it's not really going to translate. So it's going to be in your won't have bucket for that particular release. And when you come to that point where you feel now that makes value to the customer, then it would come up, up in your priority.
He also have a second question. So what is a healthy size for an agile team?
Got it. So again, the smaller, the better. I would say go with less than 10, not really bigger, right? 7 to 10 members I have seen works much better. And you can have multiple feature teams. So that's something I always recommend as well. So say, for example, you're building case management, you're doing some service related features. You're also having some sales related features. And you're also having some marketing related features, like in a typical multi-cloud environment. You can have them as your separate feature teams, separate teams. And then you can work amongst each other wherever you're kind of handshaking through your scrum of scrums or those ceremonies like that. So you're ironing out any dependencies or handshake between your teams in that. So I would recommend to keep it like less than 10, 7 to 10. And if there is a huge need, then try to see if you can make multiple feature teams. And to answer your question on which roles cannot be skipped. So usually the scrum teams, the scrum squad, I call it, like you have a product owner who is responsible for your backlog, who helps to understand what the business problem is, what are we trying to solve for, and all that details. You have a scrum master who is like typically your servant leader or the master who is trying to facilitate all your ceremonies, try to remove any risks or impediments the team has while they're trying to deliver the product goal. And then you have the Scrum team itself, the developers, right? So when I say developers, I don't mean the people who code or config. These are product development. So anybody that is needed for building this particular product and deliver, that could be architects, that could be people who are administrators, people who are good at coding because there could be some complex pieces. There could be integration experts, there could be UI experts. Depends again on the project. These are people with different skill set to ensure the product goal can be achieved. So you can have multiple different people. If you ask me who is really, really important, that's a decision that you need to make on what kind of project that you're working on. I would definitely don't go without a product owner, because you need someone to own your product backlog and ensure we know that someone has it prioritized, someone has all the information captured. Sometimes I do see product owners are from the client side. It's not from your consulting side, which is fine. All that you need is someone who will be able to own the product backlog entirely and tell us what needs to be built, right? What is the value that we are trying to achieve? So that's something critical. Scrum Master is also critical, because Scrum Master is going to be the one who is going to kind of, he or she, or they will be the true leader, right? So they are going to help us facilitate all the ceremonies. They're going to take us through the process. So the Scrum Master is a person who will go and, during our daily scrums, they will see how we are progressing through the sprints, how our burn down chart looks like, how our burn up chart looks like, how the velocity looks like, all that kind of cool stuff Scrum Master gets to do. So the Scrum Master is important as well. And the Scrum team itself, the developers, again, like I said, the different skill set that you might need to ensure the product goal is achieved. So again, pick and choose based on what skill sets you need for the project. Not every Scrum team requires an UI expert. Not every Scrum team requires an architect, expert or an integration expert. It could be like very small program, doesn't have too much of integrations. It's fairly straightforward. A lot of things they're leveraging out of the box. Then you don't need such kind of roles as well. I hope I answered that question.
And then we have another new question from Anish, if I pronounced the name correctly. So the question is, our issue is business priority keeps changing. How to set this as a process to run?
Got it.
Pro tips.
Yeah, it's typically the Agile world, and why Agile works like a charm for a lot of the Salesforce implementations as well, right? priority keeps changing because our business keeps changing. And that I always say, like, this is the best time for us to talk through this. Like this COVID time over the last couple of years, a lot of things have changed. The way we are doing business have changed. The way we are communicating, collaborating has changed, right? So change is the only constant. Things are going to keep changing. So we need to be agile and ensure that we're capturing all these as we are grooming and prioritizing our backlog. So prioritization is not a one-time exercise. It's an ongoing exercise, right? So we need to ensure when I go into my sprint, I always ensure, is this still your, like, these are the prioritizations we discussed before. We have an upcoming sprint. Is this still your, topmost priority? Has anything changed? So we need to ensure that it's an ongoing discussion and we kind of do this as a regular thing instead of just doing it as a one-time and locking it, say like, hey, this is the first priority. It is never like that, because as we build and as the application shapes, things change and the business priorities change, and we just need to ensure that we are accommodating it through our journey.
Thank you. So we cleared all the questions on the Q&A tab.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Is there any other question? No, right? Good. Oh, I just saw a part of Christian's question now. We're often tasked to build cars which get only accepted once they drive. Is that okay? Yeah, I think the way to handle that is, if your expectation is to build as your car which you can drive at the end of your release one, try to ensure you have, I don't know if you've seen this picture, it's a very cool thing. First getting those wheels ready, and then, it's still something that you can transport through, but then it's still not your car. So you're able to still move around with your, what you have, but then it becomes initially like your skaters, then it becomes like your bike, then it becomes like your car, things like that, right? So we can still ensure that we are able to still make it a value to the customer through our sprints, but your release is going to be the car which you can drive. But you start assembling those parts in a prioritized way that you are still able to drive with those parts, though you don't have this fancy, car structure built around you. I hope that answered, Christian.
So thank you again for everyone to join, and thank you for Suha. It's a wonderful section. I learned a lot personally, and this is not a very usual community presentation topic. Trust me, I attend 1,000 of this kind of conferences or meeting all along. So this is really wonderful section. Thank you for everyone to join, and stay tuned for other section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for being the amazing host. And thank you, Pakistan Rimming, for the opportunity. And thanks to each and every one of you who made to the session and stayed till the end and participated. Thank you all. You have a wonderful rest of the event.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.